My name is Simone Montgomery. I am 67 years old, and I kept my study locked for 14 years. The code was December 3rd, 1958, my husband Isaiah's birthday. I never changed it, not once, in all that time. For most of my life, I believed one simple thing. If you love people quietly and long enough, they will eventually show you exactly who they are. I found out exactly how right I was on a Tuesday night in July, sitting alone in my kitchen on Cottage Grove Avenue in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, at 11 o'clock at night with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of me. By the time this story is finished, you'll understand exactly why an old woman kept a door locked for 14 years, and why that lock turned out to be the smartest thing she ever did. But the night that proved it wasn't some evening I'd planned for. It started with a phone call I almost let go to voicemail. The phone rang at 10:47. I remember the time because I'd just glanced at the microwave clock, wondering if it was too late to call my daughter back about Sunday dinner. When I picked up, it wasn't Sunday dinner she wanted to talk about. "Mom," she whispered. Just that. My daughter, Amara Franklin, 32 years old, whispering into her own phone in her own apartment in Hyde Park like she was afraid the walls might repeat her. "Amara? Baby, what's wrong?" "Raven went in the study. While you were at your appointment at University of Chicago Medical Center. She found the spare key on the hook by the pantry, and Mom, I think she copied it." I want to tell you my heart dropped. It didn't. That's the strange thing about being underestimated your whole life. After a while, you stop being surprised when people finally show their hand. My heart didn't drop. It slowed down, the way it does right before you make a decision you've already made 100 times in your head. I set my coffee cup down on the oak table, the same table Isaiah and I bought secondhand back in 1994 and refinished ourselves one August weekend, sweating through 2 shirts apiece, arguing over polyurethane. I looked up at the staircase leading to the second floor, to the room I'd kept locked all these years, that same code still glowing faintly at the top of the stairs. And I said to my daughter, calm as still water, "Don't let her know you called me. I'll handle it." Now, before I tell you what handling it meant, you need to understand who I am and what that study really holds. Because this isn't a story about a scared old widow. This is a story about a woman who has been quietly, patiently, and lovingly preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. Let me take you back. 14 years ago, my husband Isaiah Coleman lay in a hospital bed with tubes running into his arm, and I made a decision nobody around me knew about. I was a regional operations manager at an insurance company downtown in the Loop. A good job, a job I'd fought hard for. I walked away from it. I sold my car. I pawned my wedding ring, the very one Isaiah slipped on my finger under a maple tree in Washington Park, just to help cover chemotherapy bills insurance wouldn't touch. I took a job stocking shelves on the night shift at the Jewel Osco on 47th Street, wearing a hairnet at 53 years old, coming home smelling like bleach and cardboard, just in time to get Amara off to school. Nobody knew any of that. To the family, to the neighbors, to the church ladies at Sunday service, I was just lucky enough to have a paid-off house. Nobody asked how the house stayed paid off. Nobody asked what I gave up to keep it that way. I remember standing in my bedroom one night, looking at our wedding photo, black and white, Isaiah laughing with his whole chest at 29 years old, his tie a little crooked because he'd insisted on knotting it himself. And I whispered to that photograph, "You warned me, didn't you? People love a daughter with their words, but they love money with their eyes." I thought about my late husband's aunt, Grace Parks, who cornered me at the funeral reception with a paper plate of potato salad and said, low enough that only I could hear, "Simone ought to sell that house. What does a widow woman know about property anyway?" I didn't answer her. I just refilled the lemonade pitcher and kept moving. I've thought about that sentence for 14 years. I tell you all this so you understand. I am not a woman who is easily caught off guard. I am a woman who has been paying very close attention. So when Amara called me whispering about a copied key, I didn't panic. I walked straight to my desk, the same desk in that locked study, and opened the bottom drawer, the one with the false back Isaiah built into it himself, God rest him, back when he still had his hands and his stubborn insistence on doing everything the right way, not the easy way. Inside was a small flash drive. I plugged it into my laptop. 8 months earlier, after Raven had spent an evening pushing me to get the property properly reassessed, a conversation I'll tell you more about shortly, I made a quiet decision of my own. I called a security company the very next morning and had a small camera installed in that study, tucked into the bookshelf, aimed at the desk and the filing cabinet. If someone was circling my house like it was already half theirs, I intended to know exactly how close they'd gotten. I pressed play. There she was, Raven Lawson, my daughter's wife, standing in my study in broad daylight, going through my filing cabinet one folder at a time, her phone held up, photographing document after document. I watched her lips move. I turned up the volume. "This one," she murmured to herself, snapping a photo of what I'm fairly sure was the property deed. "This is definitely worth something." I sat there in my quiet kitchen, coffee gone cold, and I watched my daughter-in-law's whole plan unfold in silence on a laptop screen. Looking back, I understand now why I didn't feel fear watching that footage. I had spent 14 years afraid of losing control over the one thing I'd sacrificed everything to protect. And control, even in the ugliest form of proof, felt safer to me than uncertainty ever had. Underneath my calm sat an old wound, the fear of becoming the foolish widow everyone quietly assumed I'd turn into. Watching Raven confirmed my worst suspicion, but it also quieted a deeper fear, that I hadn't protected my family well enough. That's why I didn't panic that night. I had already spent a lifetime turning fear into preparation. I called Amara back. My voice was flat, controlled, the voice I used to run staff meetings downtown before I ever knew what chemotherapy copays were. "Baby, don't let her know you called me. I'll handle it." I hung up and I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at that locked door with its little keypad glowing faintly in the dark hallway. 12/03, 1958. The same numbers 14 years running. I smiled. Not a warm smile, the other kind. The kind a woman smiles when she realizes she has already won a fight the other person doesn't know has started. "Copy it then," I said out loud, to nobody but the empty stairwell. "I'm already a step ahead of you." Now, if you're just now joining me, you might be wondering how a sweet, church-going, pie-baking grandmother of one ends up running surveillance on her own daughter-in-law's every move. Well, stay with me, because before Raven Lawson ever touched that spare key, she had already spent 22 months teaching me exactly who she was, one small, charming lie at a time. And by the time she made her move on that study, I had already built something she never saw coming. Don't go anywhere. This is only the beginning. Let me tell you about the first time I ever laid eyes on Raven Lawson, because looking back now, I can see the whole shape of this drama family conflict sitting right there in that first Sunday dinner, if only I'd known exactly what I was looking at. It was 22 months before that phone call. Amara brought her home to Sunday dinner, the way she'd brought home a few young women over the years, always a little nervous, always watching my face for approval before she'd even taken her coat off. This one arrived 40 minutes late, wearing a smile that stretched just a touch too wide, like she'd practiced it in the car. Raven walked through my house the way you'd walk through an open house with a realtor, slow, appraising, her eyes moving over every wall, every piece of furniture Isaiah and I had collected over 30 years from estate sales and little shops around the Bronzeville Historic District. She ran a hand along the mantel and said, "This place has real character in its bones." And I remember thinking, that's an odd thing to say about a home you're visiting for the first time. You say that about a house you're pricing. Then came the questions, not cruel ones, just a little too intimate for a first dinner. What's the yearly cost to maintain a place like this? Have you ever thought about downsizing, Miss Simone? Is your life insurance still active? I answered politely, the way you do at your own table, and I filed every one of those questions away in the back of my mind, the same way I used to file away red flags in budget meetings downtown. A woman doesn't survive 14 years of quiet widowhood without learning to notice which questions are curiosity and which are inventory. I want to be honest about something here, because I know some of you are wondering, if I noticed all this on night 1, why didn't I say something sooner? The truth is simpler than you'd think. My daughter had been let down before. If I came at her wife with suspicion and no proof, all I would have accomplished was pushing Amara further into Raven's arms and further away from mine. I needed certainty, not a hunch. So I did the only thing I know how to do well. I watched, I waited, and I gathered. For the first 14 months, the pattern held steady but slow. Raven was always building her freelance brand, that was the phrase, every single time, but somehow my daughter paid for all of it. The apartment in Hyde Park ran $2,800 a month. The leased Mercedes GLC came to $720 a month. Add the gym membership, the spa days, the weekend trips to Millennium Park with friends who always seemed to order the most expensive thing on the menu. Amara paid, every time, smiling, telling herself it was temporary, an investment in their shared future. Then, right around the 14-month mark, something shifted. Raven started floating an idea, softly at first, the way water finds a crack before it ever floods anything. Maybe we should move in with your mom, help take care of her, save money. I declined that one gently, the way you decline a second helping at a potluck, polite, firm, no explanation needed. So she pivoted. Renovating the house. Suddenly there were suggestions about repainting, updating the kitchen, and then the one that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Getting the property properly reassessed. That same week, I called Aaliyah Freeman, my attorney. Aaliyah is 45, sharp as a tack, the kind of woman who wears her hair in neat cornrows pulled into a high bun and thin-framed glasses that make her look like she's already 3 steps ahead of whatever you're about to say. She's handled my affairs since before Isaiah passed, and she has never once needed me to explain myself twice. That same week, I also called the security company about the camera. 1 suspicion, 2 calls, both quiet, both permanent. We arranged, carefully, for a prenuptial agreement to come through Raven's own attorney, framed as standard procedure for estates over $1 million. True, tactful, and impossible to argue with without looking exactly like what you are. Raven signed it, but she complained to Amara that same night, "Your family doesn't trust me." Baby, I thought when Amara told me that. Trust is earned in the daylight, not demanded in the dark. Let me tell you something else, something I never told anybody until now. Every time Raven said, "Mom's getting older, it's not safe for her to live alone," I thought back to 12 years earlier when I quietly sold a small parcel of land Isaiah had left us on the south side, just to cover Amara's tuition at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I never told my daughter. I never told anyone. I just handled it, the way I've handled everything, in the dark, so the people I love could stand in the light. I remember relatives whispering after Isaiah's funeral, "Simone doesn't have a career anymore, she just knows how to keep house." And I smiled and refilled somebody's sweet tea and said nothing. Silence was dignity back then. I was starting to sense it had gone on long enough that it needed to become something else. 3 days after the prenup was signed, I got a text from Aaliyah that I still have saved on my phone. "Simone, the account we set up 6 months ago just cleared. Every transfer from the trust into the scholarship fund is ready to go. 1 signature left." I read that message twice, standing in my kitchen, the coffee maker gurgling behind me. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and looked up at our wedding photo on the wall. Isaiah, 29, laughing with his whole chest. "You'd have liked watching this play out," I told him quietly. "You always did enjoy being 3 moves ahead of somebody who thought they were the only one playing." Raven thought she was the hunter here. She had no idea the prey had been setting traps of her own for a very long time. I want to pause and tell you something true about this season of my life, because that's how real life is. Heartbreak and humor sitting right next to each other at the same table. My porch swing has been creaking since the Eisenhower administration, I swear it, and every evening I sat out there turning all of this over in my mind. That old swing creaked along like it had its own opinions about Raven Lawson. My neighbor Betty, who's lived 2 doors down since before Amara was born, wandered over some evenings with her own cup of decaf and said, Simone, that child at your daughter's got a look about her. I saw somebody just like her described in one of those neighborhood posts a while back. Different name, same story. Widow out in Englewood, I believe. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wish I had written it down that very night. One Saturday, my grandnephew came by while I was trying to vacuum the front room with my old upright, the one that rattles like it's got marbles trapped inside. He calls it the old dragon because of the noise it makes, and every time he says it, I laugh despite everything else going on, because some things stay simple and sweet even while the rest of your world is quietly catching fire. I baked 2 apple pies that week for the church bazaar, flour on my hands, my mind 6 steps ahead on a chessboard nobody else knew we were playing. By the time Raven Lawson decided to copy that key to my study, she had already spent 22 months showing me, piece by piece, exactly what kind of woman she was. She just didn't know I'd been keeping notes the whole time. I stood at the bottom of my staircase that night, looking up at that little glowing keypad in the dark. 12/03/1958. Keep going, Raven, I whispered. I'm counting every step you take. So tell me straight, if your own child's spouse asked about your life insurance before she'd even finished her first dinner at your table, would you confront her that same night? Or wait and quietly gather proof the way Simone did? Comment 1 if you'd confront her on the spot. Comment 2 if you'd wait and build your case first. No fence sitting. Pick a side. The next morning, at exactly 9:15, I drove to Amara's apartment in Hyde Park. I didn't call ahead. Some conversations you don't schedule. You simply arrive, the way trouble arrives, without an appointment. Amara opened the door pale as paper. Behind her, at the kitchen table, sat Raven, phone turned face down in front of her, wearing the kind of smile you put on when you already know you're in trouble, but you're hoping nobody else has figured it out yet. I sat down across from her without being asked. I didn't take off my coat. You went into my study, I said. Raven lifted her chin, the way people do when they've decided to bluff their way through instead of telling the truth. The door was open a crack. I was worried about you, Miss Simone. You're 67, living alone. I turned to my daughter. Did you ask your wife to go into my study? Amara shook her head slowly, eyes fixed on the table. Raven's voice softened, shifted, the way water changes shape depending on what you pour it into. I was going to tell you both. I saw some paperwork in there. Looks like you made sure your daughter-in-law would never have any real rights to anything. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I had been building for months. I laid it flat on the table between us. 22 months, I said. In 22 months, Raven has deposited exactly $1,200 into the joint account. In that same time, my daughter has covered $127,000. Rent, the car lease, travel, furniture. Lawson Creative, the freelance business you keep referencing, does not exist on record with the state of Illinois. You pay $220 a month for a cleaning service, and yet you still introduce yourself at dinner parties as the one who manages the household. Raven's mouth opened, then closed. Then she found her footing again, pivoting straight to attack the way people like her always do. You control your daughter, Miss Simone. That's not protection, that's domination. I looked her dead in the eye. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In 2009, I gave up a regional director position because my husband was dying and my daughter needed a mother who was present, not one chasing a promotion. I worked night shifts. I sold my wedding ring. I sold land my husband left us just to keep my daughter in school. And I never once told her because I didn't need credit. I needed her safe. I am not controlling anyone. I simply refuse to let anyone take what I sacrificed my whole life to protect. The kitchen went quiet enough to hear the refrigerator hum. Then Amara did something I will never forget. She lifted her phone, hands trembling, and turned the screen so both Raven and I could see it. A string of messages, months old, sent to someone named Destiny. My mother-in-law's future house has got to be worth over $800K, the message read. Just gotta be patient. I'm gonna get it. The silence that followed felt like a held breath in the whole room. Raven's face drained of color. there was more. Another message in the same thread. Almost had it with that old lady out in Inglewood last time, too. This one, I'm sure of it. Raven's calculation had never really been about hating our family. It was about hunger for a kind of security no one had ever handed her honestly. Beneath the polish, the Mercedes, and the borrowed confidence was a woman who'd learned early that charm was currency, and that showing real vulnerability only invited people to take advantage of her first. Her deepest fear wasn't getting caught. It was ending up ordinary, with nothing to show for herself, the way someone in her own past once had. That's why she couldn't stop pushing, even after the prenup should have told her the game was already over. Amara's hand shook so hard the phone nearly slipped from her fingers. I put my hand over hers, steadying it, and said only, "Baby, look at what's actually in front of you." Raven stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice cracking down the middle. I rose slowly, unhurried, and looked at her the way I used to look at a junior staffer caught padding an expense report. "No," I said, "the regret's about to be entirely yours." I've had a long time to get ready for this conversation. I want to tell you something about that moment, sitting in that kitchen with my daughter's hand trembling under mine. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was grief. Grief for the 22 months my daughter had spent believing she was loved by someone who was, in truth, doing inventory on her family's grief the whole time. This is the day the drama family secrets we'd all been quietly circling around finally came out into the light, right there over cold coffee at Amara's kitchen table. But underneath that grief, there was something steadier, the same steadiness I'd carried since that hospital room 14 years ago. Because I already knew what Raven didn't. I knew about the camera footage. I knew about the trust. I knew about the letter waiting in my study, written in my husband's own hand that I hadn't shown a single living soul. We didn't say much on the ride back to Cottage Grove Avenue, just the hum of the engine and the particular kind of silence that sits between two people who both know something bigger is coming and neither one is ready to say it first. I glanced at my daughter once at a red light on 55th Street, and I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to give her a life soft enough that she'd never have to learn hard lessons the way I did. Watching her stare out that window, I understood that some lessons can't be handed to you gently. Some have to arrive exactly the way this one did, sudden, sharp, and undeniable. When we pulled into the driveway, I looked up at the second-floor window of my study, and for the first time in 14 years, I felt something other than caution when I thought about that locked door. I felt ready. Because what waited behind that door wasn't just paperwork. It was a letter my husband wrote in the last 2 weeks of his life. A letter I had been saving for exactly this kind of day. And what my daughter was about to read in that room would change everything she thought she understood about her father, her family, and the people who are supposed to protect you. Don't turn away now. This is where it gets even harder and even more necessary. Inside my study, I punched in the code on the keypad, 12/03/1958, the same numbers I'd typed 1,000 times over 14 years. The door clicked open. Amara sat down slowly in the old leather chair by the window, the one that used to be Isaiah's favorite spot for reading the Sunday paper. I walked to the fireproof cabinet in the corner, the one only I had ever opened, and pulled out an envelope that had been sealed for almost 14 years. "Your father started writing this in his last 2 weeks," I said, placing it in her hands. "He came back and added to it a few days later, before I ever sealed it away. I've been keeping it until the day it was needed." Amara's fingers shook as she opened it. She read aloud, her voice cracking on the final lines. "Baby girl, watch how people treat you when they think you have nothing left to give. Kindness performed for an audience is just a performance. Kindness given in private, that's character. Find someone who has the second kind." She broke down right there in that chair. For the first time, she realized Raven had never once asked to hear a single story about her father, only ever called his face in old photos handsome, then moved on. I didn't need to repeat every figure from the day before. She already had them. I only said, quietly, "You saw the numbers yourself yesterday. 22 months, $127,000, $1,200 in return. That was never a marriage carrying two people. That was one person carrying a marriage," Raven called over and over. Eventually, Amara answered and put her on speaker. Cornered, Raven said the truest thing she'd say the whole story. "I thought Amara had more money than she did. I thought the house would be ours someday. I stayed for love and for financial security." When Raven's voice rose, sharp and wounded, shouting, "Your parents have kept you in the dark your whole life," I answered quietly, without raising my voice at all. "I've been quiet for 14 years. Quiet when relatives told me I should sell this house. Quiet when I turned down a job offer downtown because I was afraid Amara would need someone home with her. That quiet was never weakness. It was patience, waiting for the moment it would matter most." Then Amara turned to the last page of her father's letter. There, in a slightly different shade of ink, added, I explained, 2 days after the main letter, before he ever handed it to me to keep, Isaiah had written one more line. "If anyone ever comes sniffing around what we've built, remember, Aunt Grace asked me about the will twice before I died. Be careful." Amara looked at me stunned. I nodded slowly. Somewhere in our own family, someone had quietly opened a door for Raven long before Raven ever found the spare key. Grace's betrayal wasn't born from malice so much as from a lifetime of feeling like the forgotten relative, always standing just outside the decisions that shaped this family's future. Her whispered questions about the will were never really about money. They were about mattering, about being consulted, about not disappearing the way she feared aging women in our family always seemed to. That old ache made her an easy door for someone like Raven to slip through. Not because Grace wanted to hurt us, but because, just once, she wanted to feel like she held a key to something. That's the part of the story that still sits heaviest on me, if I'm honest with you. Betrayal from a stranger stings, but you expect it, the way you expect rain in April. Betrayal from your own blood, that's the kind that changes how you sit at Thanksgiving for the rest of your life, in any drama family, mine included. Right then, Amara's phone buzzed with a text from her bank. A fraud alert, flagging an attempted transfer of $18,000 from the joint account to an account overseas, initiated 3 days earlier, currently on hold pending verification. Amara stared at the screen, her breath catching. "Mom," she whispered, "this is the money I was saving to buy a house." I sat down beside her, put my arm around her shoulders, and let her cry into that same leather chair her father used to sit in on Sunday mornings, coffee in hand, reading the box scores out loud whether anyone was listening or not. "You've seen enough today," I told her, "and I'm not finished yet. I want you to know something, if you've made it this far. Betrayal from someone who shares your bed is one kind of pain. Discovering it was made possible by someone who shares your last name is another kind entirely. But I also want you to know, because I have lived through both, that clarity, even when it's this painful, is always better than the fog you were living in before." What came next was bigger than either of us expected, bigger than a divorce, bigger than a family argument at a kitchen table. Because it turned out Raven Lawson had done this before, and this time there would be consequences reaching far beyond our family. Stay close. What happens next changes everything. Several months passed. The divorce was finalized in a courtroom on the 26th floor of the Daly Center, all fluorescent light and the low murmur of a dozen other lives quietly coming apart in adjoining rooms. Aaliyah sat beside Amara the entire time, legal pad angled so I could just make out her small, precise handwriting from where I sat 1 row back. The same handwriting I'd been reading in text messages for going on a decade. The prenup held exactly as she had drafted it, and Raven walked away with half of what remained in the joint account, roughly $4,000, and her personal belongings, nothing more. I'd known Aaliyah Freeman since 2 years before Isaiah passed, back when she was a junior associate at a firm downtown and I was just a woman trying to understand what a living will actually meant. She'd sat across from me at a scuffed conference table, 28 years old and already impatient with lawyers twice her age who talked past their clients instead of to them. And she'd said, "Mrs. Coleman, I'm going to explain this to you the way I'd explain it to my own mother, not the way they taught us to explain it in school." I never used another attorney after that. Some trust gets built in a single sentence if it's the right one. Raven called Amara one final time, her voice bitter, aimed to wound on her way out the door. "You'll always live in your mother's shadow," she said. Amara's response came calm and clear, steadier than I'd ever heard her sound. "She sized you up correctly. I just hope one day I bring home someone who proves her wrong." I felt something in my chest ease when my daughter said that. Not relief that the marriage was over. That part still carried its own quiet grief. But relief that my daughter had found her footing again, standing on her own 2 feet, speaking with a voice that sounded entirely, unmistakably like her own. That night, after the papers were signed and Amara had gone home to sleep for what she told me was the first uninterrupted night in weeks, I sat alone on my back porch a long while, the swing barely moving beneath me. I thought about the version of this story where I'd said nothing that first Sunday dinner, where I'd told myself I was imagining things, where I'd let 22 months become 22 years. I thought about Isaiah and what he would have said, and I decided he would have said exactly what he wrote in that letter, that watching how someone treats you when they think you have nothing left to give tells you everything you'll ever need to know. I sat with that a long while, coffee gone cold again, the way it seems to always go cold on the nights that matter most in this house. 2 weeks after the divorce papers were signed, my phone rang. Chicago police. Raven had been arrested, not for what she'd done to our family, but for financial fraud against other widows across the South Side. The detective's voice was even, professional, the kind of voice trained not to alarm you even while delivering something alarming. In the same call, he mentioned something that made my stomach turn cold, in a way none of the earlier revelations had. On Raven's phone, investigators had found a list of names. My name sat at the top, alongside a photo of my house, an estimated value, and a note. Easy mark, widowed, isolated, has a daughter. I asked him, before I could stop myself, whether there was an entry for a widow out in Inglewood. He paused, the particular kind of pause that tells you someone on the other end of a phone line is deciding how much they're allowed to say. And then he said there was an open case out that way, that predated ours by roughly a year and a half. I thought of Betty on my porch, decaf in hand, mentioning a woman with a look about her, and a story that sounded strange and familiar. And I felt something settle into place, cold and quiet, like a key finally turning in a lock that had been stuck for a long time. I let that sit with me a long moment after I hung up. Not fear, something closer to confirmation. I had been right to prepare. I had been right not to wait for someone else to protect what my husband and I had built. A few days later, once the shock of that had settled some, came the second piece. Amara found a file on Raven's seized laptop, a forged power of attorney, my signature copied onto it, dated 5 weeks earlier, drafted to transfer certain rights to the house into her name. Amara called me from her apartment, her voice tight and fast in a way I'd learned to recognize as her trying to stay composed rather than actually being composed. "Mom, she copied your signature. She copied it exactly." The police confirmed it, a genuine forgery, and a charge that would add real weight to the case already stacking against her. I drove over that same evening, and we sat together on Amara's small balcony overlooking the courtyard below, string lights from a neighboring building throwing soft, uneven light across the table between us. She was quieter than I expected. Not shaken the way she'd been in the study weeks before, but thoughtful, turning something over. "I keep thinking about how easy it would have been for me to just believe her," she said. "If you hadn't had that camera, if Dad hadn't written that letter, if Aunt Grace hadn't—" She stopped herself. "None of that was luck," I told her. "I spent 14 years making sure it wouldn't have to be luck. That's the whole difference between hoping for the best and preparing for the worst while hoping for the best anyway." She looked at me a long moment, and something in her face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The way you finally see a familiar photograph in better light. You've been protecting me my whole adult life, and I never even noticed. That was rather the point, baby, I said. And we both managed something close to a laugh, tired and real, the first one either of us had managed in weeks. That evening, Amara and I sat together in the study, the same room that had been locked for 14 years, and this time we opened everything. Photo albums, Isaiah's handwritten recipe box, his careful cursive listing out his mother's cornbread dressing down to the tablespoon, his master's thesis from 1987, the corners soft with age. A birthday card he'd written her years back that read simply, "We still have time, don't waste it." Amara cried reading that card, and I held her the way I used to hold her when she was small and scraped a knee on the sidewalk out front. I kept that lock for 14 years, I told her, not to shut the past away. I kept it so I'd have the right things ready for the right moment when you needed them most. My phone rang again just as we sat there. Aaliyah Freeman, my attorney, her voice quick and careful, the way it gets when something is moving faster than expected. "Simone," she said, "word's gotten out about the arrest. The question now is whether you want the fuller story told publicly or kept quiet." I looked over at my daughter, at the recipe box open between us, at the study door standing wide open for the first time in over a decade. I didn't answer Aaliyah right away. Some decisions deserve a breath before you make them. But I want you to know, I have never once in my life run from the truth. And I wasn't about to start now. Not when other women out there deserve to know they weren't the only ones. What I decided next didn't just close this chapter of our story. It opened the door to something none of us expected, including me. Amara came to me a few weeks later with an idea, and I said yes before she even finished the sentence. We used a portion of the family trust to establish the Isaiah Coleman Scholarship at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and Chicago State University. Support for Black students who had lost a parent to cancer, the way our own family had lost Isaiah. The first small ceremony was held in a community room borrowed from our church, folding chairs set in careful rows, a table and back with lemonade, and 2 of my apple pies going fast. Amara read her father's name out loud at the podium, her voice only wavering once, right at the surname, the way mine still does sometimes when I say it in an empty kitchen. It felt right. It felt like turning 14 years of quiet sacrifice into something that would keep giving long after I was gone. 3 months after that, Amara brought someone new home for dinner. Tiana Hayes, 31 years old, a structural engineer, tall and steady with kind, direct eyes, and a small scar over her left eyebrow from a bicycle accident at 9 years old. She arrived exactly on time, not a minute early or late, wearing flats instead of heels. And when she shook my hand at the door, her grip was firm and brief, no lingering, no performance in it at all. She didn't run her hand along my mantle. She didn't ask about square footage. She noticed the wedding photo on the wall, Isaiah, 29, laughing with his whole chest, and asked, unprompted, "Was he always that loud a laugher, or is that just the photo?" I liked her immediately. And I am not, as a rule, an easy woman to win over quickly. At our very first dinner together, Tiana quietly paid the whole bill before either of us could reach for it, and said, with an easy laugh, "I've got a rule. I pay for the first 4 times we go anywhere. After that, we split." No calculation behind her eyes when she said it, just a fact about herself, offered plainly, the way you'd mention what neighborhood you grew up in. Before I could even bring up the subject gently, Tiana asked her own attorney about drafting a prenup. "I love Amara," she told me plainly, sitting right there at my kitchen table, the same oak table Isaiah and I had refinished together back in 1994. "I don't love her assets. I want that in writing so nobody ever has to wonder." That, right there, is the difference between kindness performed for an audience and kindness that's simply who a person is when no one's asking them to prove it. One evening, not long after, Tiana sat out on the back porch with me while Amara ran inside for more sweet tea. And in the quiet between us, the swing creaking its old familiar creak, she asked, careful and unhurried, "What was he like?" "Isaiah." Amara talks about him like he was larger than life, but I don't think she's told me who he actually was. So I told her about the box scores read aloud to no one, about the crooked tie in our wedding photo because he insisted on knotting it himself, about the maple tree in Washington Park, about a man who noticed things quietly and only spoke up when it mattered most. I told her about the letter. I didn't tell her everything. Some things still belong only to Amara and to me, but I told her enough that she understood by the end of it exactly what kind of family she was being welcomed into, and exactly what kind of love this family expected her to show in return. The night everything with Raven finally settled, I made my decision. I turned over everything I had, 8 months of camera footage, recordings, the message threads, the forged document, to my attorney and the police. Within days, the story had spread quickly across local news stations and newspapers throughout Chicago. A woman accused of systematically defrauding widows across the South Side, exposed in large part through one victim's own home security footage. Raven lost what little credibility she had left. The charges against her grew heavier. And within our own community, people made it clear this kind of behavior would not be quietly forgiven. That same week, I did something else. I signed over full control of the family trust to Amara, years earlier than her father had originally specified, because Isaiah always said the trust should only pass early if she proves she's ready. She was ready. She'd more than proven it. Amara cried when I handed her those papers. I held her the way I'd held her the night she read her father's letter for the first time. That lock was never about shutting the past away, I told her again, and this time I meant it with my whole chest. It was about making sure you'd have exactly what you needed, exactly when you needed it. That evening, we sat out on the back porch together, the swing creaking beneath us the way it's creaked since long before either of my grandnieces or nephews were born, watching the neighbor's dog, Oscar, trot over for his evening drink from our garden hose, the way he does most nights around 6. The air smelled like cut grass and somebody's charcoal grill 2 yards over. And somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped shut twice. That particular summer evening sound that hasn't changed in this neighborhood in 40 years. Every drama family has a season like this. The breaking, and then, if you're lucky, the healing that comes after. Amara leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for keeping that lock." "Thank you," I told her, "for finally looking back to see what was behind you." I looked up at the second-floor window of my study, the light still on, the keypad still glowing faintly with the same 12 numbers it's held for 14 years. I never did change that code. Not because I couldn't, because for the first time in 14 years, I finally understood what that lock had really been protecting. It was never about keeping the past shut away. It was about guarding a future I had given everything to build. That night, watching my daughter lean into the woman who finally loved her the right way, I smiled and said the only thing left to say. "Now," I told her, "I can finally rest." This story reminds us that comfort, at our age, can be practical, not just poetic. If you're a widow or widower sitting with your own cooled cup of coffee tonight, here's what I'd tell you. Not as a life coach, just as a neighbor. Write down where your important papers live and tell one trusted person where to find them. If someone new asks about your finances before they've asked about your late husband's favorite song, notice that. It's information, not paranoia. It's all right to insist on a prenup on your child's behalf. Real love can sign its name next to protection without flinching. Keep a small camera by your files if it helps you sleep, not because you expect the worst, but because clarity is kinder than suspicion left to fester alone in a quiet house. And when your children finally bring someone home who reaches for the bill before you can reach for your purse, and never once asks what the house is worth, let yourself notice that too. Dignity, at the end of the day, isn't loud. It's a woman keeping her own record straight so that when the moment comes, she isn't guessing. She's ready.